Hi everyone. Today I would like to talk about the history of urban planning, discussing specifically socialist ideas in urban development, which are quite popular both in the Soviet Union space and abroad. Let's talk about the socialism. If we talk about the socialist idea itself, which was the foundation of the Soviet Union, it is safe to assume that its ideological founders were Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. These ideas, without a doubt, were quite significant during the industrial age in 19th century when cities were rapidly growing, fueling migration inequality. For example, in Engels' article, The Great Towns from the Conditions of the Working Class in England, the author objectively discussed the conditions of the working class who lived and died in horrible unsanitary conditions. Central point of Marxism is class struggle as a primary driver of the society's progress. According to Marx and Engels' teachings, every society has a different classes in conflicts with each other, and governmental institutions serve as tools that support ruling class interests. These parallels can be seen in the more modern authors of the urban studies and sociologists such as David Harvey. In his working title, From Managerialism to Entrepreneurialism, the transformation in urban governance in late capitalism, he explored the shift in urban management towards entrepreneurship, where cities behave like corporations driven by economic competition, leading to growing inequality. Logically, there are negative consequences from the exclusive pursuit of profit, increasing inequality and threatening sustainable social development. Underpinning these ideas is always the exploitation by capitalists strongholds of the working class, whether they are proletarians in the factories, social economically disadvantaged groups with the low incomes, or modern urban dwellers living in a sprawling metropolises. There is a logic in all this, but competition, conflict, and debate are drivers of the progress. Through these processes, developed societies and the wealthy countries have become successful. However, according to Marx, all representatives of the simple class have common interests and share common class enemies, the capitalists. Marx's doctrine exclusively positioned class struggles as the sole driving force, and it's crucial not to delve into the socialist countries' urban development experiences, which proved inefficient. It is not class struggle per classical Marxism that leads to sustainable development and the proper societal formation, but economical efficiency. Slavery became ineffective, leading to emergence of the feudal system at a certain historic stage. Similarly, capitalism using wage labor proved ineffective, ending the feudal system. Returning to urban planning, let's discuss the importance of not overindulging in non-functional economic ideas to pursue social justice and avoid repeating the USSR's 70-year grim experience. Here I propose to focus on the housing experience and discuss the phenomenon of the Soviet communal apartments era. To briefly narrate the history of the communal apartments, they became a part and a parcel of the state and a housing policy, spreading widely in all cities, mainly in large ones. Lenin declared his norm in this article, can Bolsheviks retain state power? This article was crafted for proletarians' audience, detailing actions post-October Revolution and describing how poor proletarian families can be forced into wealthy individuals' apartments. A unit of soldiers would arrive at the rich person's apartment, inspect it, and upon discovering, for example, 3 rooms for a single family, they would note that now the family would live in 1 room while preparing the other 2 for 2 more families. Meanwhile, escaping famine and the poverty, rural inhabitants flocked to large cities. The right to private ownership and the urban property was abolished in August 1980, making all apartments socialist property. Sanitary standards were reduced to 9 square meters per person and then to 5.5 square meters. This launched what became known as densification, housing new residents. Roughly 10 completely unfamiliar families were cramped into once luxurious apartments of the wealthy person, while the previous property owners were adjusted to living in one of these rooms. In Moscow alone, nearly 500,000 individuals moved into communal apartments, and in Petersburg, 300,000. The 1920s saw the start of the industrialization and the collectivization, prompting waves of relocations from village to cities. Rapid wooden barracks constructions unfolded, along with the emergence of the more communal apartments. Densification was fast-paced, and extra spaces, wherever feasible, were converted for new tenants. Former mansions, hotels, and even stables were adapted for communal living. Communal apartments even surfaced in churches and the monasteries. Typically, one apartment housed 20-30 people, if not more. Simultaneously, Soviet authorities experimented with a new housing type where household tasks would be equally distributed among all residents, termed like house commune, entailing scheduled shared laundry, cleaning, meal preparation, factory labor, and even joint child rearing. Several houses of this kind were built. However, the grandiose communal dwelling experiments were shut down in the 1930s as authorities admitted their utopian nature. Citizens resided in plywood delimited apartments where workers, intellectuals, and the military personnel learned to coexist amicably, sharing cooking facilities in one kitchen and one bathroom. Central heating was absent during this period. Different kinds of stoves were mainly used for heating if one was preserved from previous owners. In such houses, people do not only share a common kitchen and toilets, but the latter might not even exist. In the 1930s, one-third of the Moscow's residents used cesspits, holes in the ground that were filled and covered. Even in case where there was one toilet at the end of the corridor for 30-40 people, its conditions left much to be desired as it was a shared facility. These toilets rarely saw any repairs, and the sanitation was always an issue. As for the kitchen, was also shared, and like any shared space, the issue of neglect and the lack of the hygiene were like those with the toilets. All this was happening in the socialist state in 1930s, even before the onset of the World War II. Soviet citizens were about to enter a new phase of the urban development, marking an era of the micro-districts. Let's move forward 20 years and explore the success of the Soviet planning in the post-war period. Now let's discuss how legendary Soviet micro-districts came to be. Once renowned architect Le Corbusier, inspired by France's eastern colonies, proposed a utopian plan to reconstruct Paris. It was proposed that the entire city be demolished and the current structures in Paris be built in its place, drawing tourists worldwide. It was suggested that 20-30-story towers connected by the wide highways be constructed, which, according to futurists of that time, would represent the city of the future. In Zeynep Çelik's book Le Corbusier, Orientalism, Colonialism, one called discern how Le Corbusier architectural project reflected imperialistic ideas of the power and the control over colonies and the conquered people. These ideas of control, power, and the suppression were similarly reflected in Soviet micro-districts projects. The concept of individually comfortable housing, owning at home, or at least at apartments, became especially relevant in the USSR during the post-war Soviet period. Many cities had been destroyed and needed rebuilding, leading to widespread construction. The housing issues in the Soviet Union were notably severe. The grand Stalinist buildings, recognized as a symbol of the Soviet regime, they were only housing for the elite. There were a few of them, and the most Soviet citizens still lived in barracks without electricity and sewage. The monstrous wartime destruction only exacerbated the situation. Khrushchev's famous battle against excesses, namely the rejection of the monumental Stalinist architecture in favor of the simple yet mass-produced architecture, was on its way, like a revolutionary decision. The famous Khrushchev's apartments were not perceived as we perceive them today. Back then, they represented a breakthrough made possible through the establishment of the mass production of the panels at factories. This allowed homes to be assembled in just weeks or sometimes days. At the same time, new urban planning norms were adopted, including basic requirements for heating, electrification, and plumbing. Planners and engineers of the planned economy of that era aimed to swiftly and massively create individual apartments for families across the vast nation, so people could move from barracks and the communal apartments to new housing. There were no resources for something more comfortable, and at that time it wasn't that crucial. Moving from barracks and the communal apartments to their separate housing felt much better. Such ideas of massive planned construction ideas, primarily aimed at creating equitable housing, were revisited in Europe and the USA. Under capitalism, it quickly became apparent that its idea didn't work. The most known and the dramatic example of the Pruitt-Igoe district in St. Louis, USA. This is discussed in the chapter Visual Orders and its limitations and possibilities in Jane Jacobs' book, The Death and the Life of the Great American Cities, where the author explores the concept of the visual order in urban planning and its limitations. The book argues that attempts to create orderly and symmetrical urban spaces often ignore complex human interactions. It has also criticized modernist approaches and ideas about architecture and the planning that strives for simplified visual order, as seen in various city redevelopment projects in the mid-20th century in the USA. Pruitt-Igoe is a micro-district of the 33 11-story buildings. It visually resembles any Soviet bedroom community. Built in 1956, by 1974 it was entirely demolished, turning from the home of the future into a hopeless ghetto, that its destruction was the only acceptable solution to accumulated problems. Due to specific resettlement policies, the history of Pruitt-Igoe quickly illustrates the primary issues with the idea of the building such housing that the functionalists of that time overlooked. After the building's opening, it was predominantly inhabited by poor African Americans who had relocated from slums. Initially, this seemed like a realization of the social justice. Comfortable housing should be accessible to all, but many new residents weren't ready to appreciate free housing. This moment underscored the crucial role of the environment. Large empty spaces between identical buildings facilitated enough sunlight into apartments. So tuberculosis no longer threatened residents. The Pruitt-Igoe situation led to an increase in crime, robberies, drug distribution, and even murders. Eventually, the situation deteriorated, so the police stopped even responding to calls. Those who could afford to leave did so, and the area increasingly transformed into a ghetto. Learning from the Pruitt-Igoe example and other housing projects, Western countries gradually moved away from such constructions. Soviet citizens also quickly realized that there was something wrong with these panel neighborhoods. This sentiment is well illustrated in the Central Soviet New Year's film, The Irony of the Fate, or Enjoy Your Bath. Ирония судьбы или с легким паром. The movie criticized the endless fields of the standardized real estate development and architecture that are inhuman in scale, a theme articulated back in 1976. At that time, the rapidly impoverished and the generally conservative Soviet state did not regard the experience of the capitalist countries as relevant to a planned economy. Moreover, given the differences in the market dynamics compared to Western countries, it was not directly applicable because housing demand and the supply in the Soviet Union were not formed through market measures. Now let's examine the compare Soviet housing 20 years later with the conditions its main ideological adversary, the United States. The 1970s were marked by significant economic difficulties and a decade-long profound crisis in the United States. By contrast, the Soviet economy was thriving with record oil prices before the start of the Afghanistan war. Not everyone, especially in the United States, is familiar with what is a typically Soviet apartment was like. A small 2- or 3-room apartment in a standardized panel building, small-scaled meant a 2-room apartment ranging from 30 to 100 square meters. Let's look at the living conditions through the lens of the two families, the Johnsons living in the US in 1970s and the Ivanovs from the Soviet Union in the same decade. By then, the Johnsons lived in their own house exceeding 100 square meters, featuring 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. Albeit older and somewhat cramped homes from the 1960s or prior, in the United States during the 70s, living spaces increased significantly as people craved roomier environments. By this time, an average family of 3-4 in the US had around 140 square meters of living space with about 44 square meters per person, which would grow to 60 square meters per person by 1980s. In the Soviet Union, housing conditions improved as well. For instance, our protagonists, the Ivanovs, were allocated a separate 2-room apartment in the 1960s when many new homes were constructed rapidly to resettle people from communal apartments. Since then, they had children and were queued for better living conditions. In that era, families were put on the waiting list if each person had less than 5-7 square meters and in some regions even less than 3 square meters. Imagine the cramped conditions with the waiting list stretching a decade long. However, even when a new apartment was allocated, the family could not own it. In the socialist regime, ownership was reserved for the state and the people used property indefinitely. Upon the death of the tenant, housing rights are transferred to those registered in the apartment. An alternative was to buy a cooperative apartment. Still, this was only accessible to those with the less than 6.5 square meters per person. This also involved joining a waiting list and paying down a payment of 34,000 rubles, worth approximately 680 average monthly Soviet wages. But as with these many Soviet mechanisms, what really mattered was not money but connections. At this time in the USA, a family, even with children, could buy a house on a mortgage because salaries allowed for serving the loan. And even an ordinary apartment in the States is not quite that what Soviet people were used to calling an apartment. Each family member had their own bedroom, and there was also a separate spacious dining room where a family would have a breakfast, lunch, and dinner rather than in the kitchen like in the USSR. In the Soviet Union, only families of the officials, generals, artists, and generally only those who were referred to as the nomenklatura lived in such manner. The rest of the citizens had very modest living conditions. The bleakness of the Khrushchev's era apartments became apparently quite quickly already by the late 1960s. That's why precisely in the 1970s, better housing started to be developed, sometimes referred to as Brezhnevka high-rises, slightly more spacious than the 1-room apartment of 33 square meters. Yet even in those, people had to partition space with the wardrobes and the makeshift screens to create even a vague sense of the personal space. In 3-room apartments, up to 10 people could live together: grandparents, mom and dad, and their 3 children, and the mom's brother with his wife and children. Try to imagine how in such overcrowded apartments people managed to have children. Just imagine for a moment the lengths they had to go to give a life for new citizens of the socialist country. Let's briefly touch on the topic of the home infrastructure of that time. Comrade Ivanov, for example, wants to call his mom, who luckily for him lives separately. For this, he needs to go outside to a telephone booth. He doesn't have a phone at home, and he'll call his mom at work because she doesn't have a phone at home either. In a country with a population of more than 260 million people in 1970s, there were only 2-3 million home telephones. Even 10 years later, in the 1980s, there were only 6-7 million home phones. In the Soviet Union, it was a luxury to order a telephone installation. It was almost impossible. People had to wait for years, sometimes even decades, which is why when Soviet citizens needed to make a phone call, they put on their coats and went outside to find the phone booth. There weren't many phone booths in the Soviet cities, so residents of the major cities often had to go to the subway. One might only find them in the city center in a small city. You can understand the situation in the rural areas, which by the 1979 census still comprise around 40% of the population. To make long-distance call, one had to go to the special places called the negotiation point. In some places, people even had to pre-order the conversation and return at the appointed time. And what does Mr. Johnson in America do when he wants to call his mom? He doesn't have to go anywhere as boss. He and his mom have telephones at home. In the USA, by 75s, 90% of the families had home phones, except those living in very remote farms. In the USSR, meanwhile, only about 1% of the population had telephones. Now let's see how Soviet and American families were equipped with the household appliances. The Ivanov family most likely has a refrigerator, but in the 70s, only 2/3 of the Soviet citizens owned one. The others could only preserve food in the winter by simply hanging it outside the window. They may have a washing machine, but not an automatic one. Water had to be filled manually, and the clothes need to be spun by hand. The machine could not only spin the laundry, and it did not even heat water. But it could be the case that they didn't have a washing machine at all. At the beginning of the 70s, 2/3 of the Soviet population didn't have washing machines. It wasn't something you could go and buy. You had to get a waiting list and wait several years and save money during the time. Washing machine would cost an equivalent 3 or 4 monthly salary. They likely don't have a vacuum cleaner. At the beginning of the 70s, only 60% of the Soviet families had vacuum cleaners, rising to 35% by the late 80s. Keep in mind we were talking about an urban family in the USSR. If the Ivanovs lived in the rural areas, they might not have had any of above. Additionally, they might not have had gas, sewage, or central heating, and there wasn't even electricity in some areas. What kind of home appliances did Mr. and Mrs. Johnson have? Refrigerators were in every home in the USA. Many American families had washing machines, and often automatic ones, functioning just like they do today. Every family in the US had vacuum cleaners, making them as much a staple as the refrigerator. It's possible that the household also had a dishwasher. By the mid-70s, they had in more than 2/3 of the American homes, having been introduced in homes since the late 40s. In general, Soviet appliances lagged a decade behind the Western counterparts and were outrageously expensive compared to wages. This is just a small comparison between the American family and the Soviet family. Of course, more analogs could be drawn, but it is not ideal to disappoint the viewer. The reasons for this situation in the socialist planned economy were multiple, one of the main being the planned economy itself and the uneven distribution of goods across regions. The problem with the Marxist doctrine was that it became the foundation for building a totalitarian society where there was no opposition, and anyone trying to critique socialism or speak up about injustice faced either exile in the best case or execution in the worst case. As a result, the Soviet Union failed to surpass the West in this race and failed to provide its citizens with a decent life. The harsh and pointless experiment of the building socialism ended in failure. In my personal conclusion, it is impossible to build an ideal society and the urban space through Marxism or any other theory. However, minimizing negative consequences, inequality, and poverty is possible by legally advocating for rights, creating dialogue, and stimulating competition, like any other effective economic sector. In civilized states where institutions function, civil labor markets exist, and the citizens' rights are protected, there are no class conflicts between capitalists and the workers. On the contrary, by meeting each other's needs, both can become wealthier and improve the standard of living in society, positively transforming urban spaces. Thank you for that. That's all for me.